He's out. Breitbart announced today that Steve Bannon, President Trump's one-time advisor and top champion, was stepping down from his post at the right-wing website. Bannon quickly fell out of favor, of course, last week after the publication of the new book, Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff. In the book, Bannon is quoted bad-mouthing members of Trump's own family. He called Donald Jr. and his meeting with the Russians treasonous and unpatriotic. He later tried to backtrack, Bannon did, saying he wasn't talking about the president's son. But the damage was done. His main financial backers publicly distanced themselves. And by this past weekend, the president bestowed the Trumpian version of the kiss of death, a nickname.
Just so you know, I never interviewed with him in the White House at all. He was never in the Oval Office. I don't know this man. I guess Sloppy Steve brought him into the White House quite a bit, and it was one of those things. That's why Sloppy Steve is now looking for a job.
Well, he is certainly now. White House aides also took to the air to bash their one-time colleague, now known as Sloppy Steve. Here was Stephen Miller trashing the man once seen as his ally in the administration. Let's watch.
It's tragic and unfortunate that Steve would make these grotesque comments so out of touch with reality and obviously so vindictive. And the whole White House staff is deeply disappointed in his comments. It reads like an angry, vindictive person spouting off to a highly discreditable author.
Wow. Again, the news today, Steve Bannon has become the first casualty of the book Fire and Fury. And what's clear is Trump is stewing over his depiction of himself in the book as isolated and ill-informed, surrounded by White House staffers concerned about his mental state. I'm joined right now by the author of Fire and Fury, Michael Wolff. Michael, what do you think when you watch this today with the announcement that Bannon is gone from Breitbart, his post, the thing he created?
I'm thinking that the real villain of the book, who is Donald Trump, is still ensconced in the White House. So it's a little bit of a tragedy here.
For whom? For the country.
For the American people, yes.
Let me ask you about, do you see a cause and effect between the words he spoke about the president's family, including the president's son and namesake, and the fact that he can't even hold a job at Breitbart as of today?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there. I think he can't hold the job at Breitbart because the president at this moment in time was much stronger than Steve Bannon thought he would be. My theory on this is that Bannon thought Roy Moore would win, and that would put Steve in a very strong position and the president in a very weak position. And at that moment, I think Steve anticipated my book would appear, and that would begin to precipitate his break with Donald Trump, who, frankly, he thinks is an idiot.
Let me ask you about the president's performance today. Out of nowhere, a press spray that usually lasts in the seconds, where they let the cameras in, he makes some burping sound to the press, and they're gone. This time, I thought, to make up for the portrayal you have given of him in the book, and maybe a very accurate one, he tried to show a very different picture of an equanimity, of a calm, collected, reasonable, open to negotiations, perfect being out there just for the cameras. Do you think he's trying to create a Potemkin village to offset the portrait you wrote in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what else could there be here? I mean, remember, just the other day he was assuring us that he was sane and stable. So this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
Let me ask you about I really mean this. When I was reading your book and I was getting this portrait, I worked in a White House, and I know what it was like to lose. I know that feeling. I was with President Carter on Marine One, and I said, I'm inside a dead bird or a bird that's dying. I can feel it. The mood in yours is a different sense. It's a scary sense. It reminds me of that Twilight episode way back in the 60s, where there's this kid with autokinetic powers, ferocious kid with no mental or emotional development, who could kill anybody he wanted to, destroy their lives terrifically, and everybody just pandered to him, pacified him. It's like there's an 8-year-old in that West Wing, and everybody around him is scared to death he'll do something really destructive if they don't please him that moment. Did you see that Twilight episode back then? Because that's what it reminds me of.
I certainly did. We're of a similar generation. But I think it's a little different than that. I mean, I think I absolutely think that the people around him have no illusions. They know who this guy is. They know what trouble he can wreak. And one of the reasons that they are there and that they continue to stay there is the hope that they can mitigate this. They can stand between him and the havoc and chaos that he is inevitably prone to. So in a sense, you want to say to these people, how can you do this? How can you enable them? But in another sense, you can see many of these people, and many of them are now gone dangerously, you can see them as patriots.
Well, let me ask you about what do you think the reaction is? I have to project here a little bit on the trajectory. These people in the White House know what happened today. Bannon has not only been kicked out of the White House, he's been kicked out of Breitbart. The president's tracked him down, or his minions have. Do you think there are now more trepidations about crossing him? More trepidations about crossing a guy who now shows a willingness to go down, hunt down his enemy, and destroy him to the end?
Yes, but the other interesting thing is that there's not really anybody, or in some sense, hardly anybody left in the White House. You know, at the end, with the loss of most of the staff that he went in there on January 20th, almost a year ago, he is left with, from what I can tell, the two senior most advisors to the President of the United States are Hope Hicks, a 28 or 29-year-old young woman whose background is as a sort of junior fashion PR person, and Stephen Miller, who everybody saw this weekend, and I don't think anybody wants to quite see again. These are the two people who are the brains of Trump's White House.
But most presidents, including our best presidents, and I don't think Trump's one of them, certainly not yet by any measure, people like Lincoln, people like Washington, I assume, Roosevelt certainly. Roosevelt made a point of making sure everyone in the White House was smarter than he was. I think Kennedy did the same. They were humble enough in their IQs, if you will. They had great temperaments that they knew they needed smarter people around them. Is there anybody who's in the White House as a general advisor, someone in the loop, in the room when there's something critical going, that he trusts as a brain, as a consigliere, if you will?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And this is, I mean, there are actually two interesting themes here. The one thing you cannot say to Donald Trump is you can't praise somebody else's intelligence. You just can't. He'll go away in a snit and with his lip curling. You cannot do it. And the other thing is that he's been repeatedly asked this question: who do you turn to? Who do you get your advice from? Who's your mainstay? And he always says, "It's me. I'm the person I turn to for advice."
Okay, and now we come to the cold, scary part of your book, the fitness question. It seems to me, and I thought about this not just a couple moments, I think it's what most people would come to mind if they're thinking about what does a president have to be, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, whatever. Presidents have to have three things. They have to have the ability to resort to reasonable judgment, to make a reasonable judgment. They have to be cool under pressure. They can't be going starkers when something goes crazy. And they have to recognize, this may be the most important thing, that they have to look at the consequences of their acts. They can't be impulsive. They have to think, if I do this, this isn't a checkers game, this is a chess game, this will this, and that will that, and I better damn well make the right option because these things will happen. Does Trump have the ability to show reasonable judgment, coolness under pressure, and recognition of consequences by the people around him?
I think that's a fine and perfect list, and on each point he does not have that attribute.
And those in the White House that you've interviewed extensively agree with that. They all agree he has those lackings, those deficits.
Each of them, the recurring description in the White House is of Trump as a child. And what is meant by that is that he needs immediate gratification. always. Nothing can be delayed. It has to be what he wants when he wants it.
Well, let's talk about gratification. I don't want to go back and talk about it, but I probably will. The small hands thing and all that seems to suggest to Trump, which is nonsensical and high schoolish. Then you get to, all right, I have bigger hands. I get bigger crowds on inaugural day, bigger, bigger, bigger. And I even have a bigger nuclear button. The idea that he has to prove to himself. He also said to me in an interview before the election, why do we have nuclear weapons if we're not going to use them? And that is really scary. They're just somehow building blocks. They're steel girders. They're windows. They're the things you put buildings up with. In other words, you use nuclear weapons. They are not a deterrent. He doesn't seem to understand that the reason you have a nuclear weapon is not to use it. Does he get that?
He doesn't. Every assumption, every conventional assumption, every assumption that has become part of modern history, he doesn't know that those assumptions exist, and he doesn't. And even if he did know those assumptions exist, he thinks he's larger than any assumption.
Let's talk about the thing that I love the facts in your book, because it is a nonfiction book with a lot of facts. We can argue around the edges, but the facts are like giant blocks of reality. One of them is his work day. Now, Ronald Reagan, everybody laughed about the fact he didn't get to work till 8:30 in the morning. Well, this guy comes to work around 11, according to your reporting. He comes in around 11, leaves about well before dinner. We used to talk during the campaign. Certainly, Secretary Clinton talked about what happens if there's a 3 o'clock in the morning. What about if there's a 9 o'clock in the morning call? Is he reachable? He locks his door. Tell me about the locking of the door and the staying up in his rooms in the morning and getting there not too late in the late afternoon.
Well, the locking of the door was something that happened early on, not too long after the inaugural, and it was. He wanted to install his own lock on the door, and the Secret Service flipped out, and there was a confrontation, and in fact, they seem, I understand, to have won that. But yeah. he wanted to block himself off. He needed that kind of privacy. Remember, on top of everything else, Trump is incredibly phobic. You know, there was he threw a fit. You know, the White House has a fairly elaborate cleaning staff and maid service, and they did his room, and he flipped out. If my shirt is on the floor, it's because I want it on the floor. If I want my sheets changed, I will strip the bed. This is unusual behavior.
Well, does that go back to he didn't like handshaking before he ran for politics? That sort of keep away physically from me in every way of my being? That is bizarre.
Yes, I would assume that this is all part of that.
Final question, and this has been fascinating. Let me ask you, congratulations on the book. I've tried to sell books. I got to tell you, I don't know how you did it, but the book leaked out and everything worked out wonderfully for you. But congratulations.
Thanks,
in fact, tonight,
Chris.
I believe, is your pub date. Lots of it happened before this pub date. Let me ask you about this just sense of the people you've talked to. And by the way, you remind me of the great reporter Joe McGinnis, who really started this behind-the-lines kind of reporting with Jeffrey McDonald, before that with the Nixon people and selling of the president, where he went in there and had an indefinite role. Nobody knew who he was, but somehow he got clearance, and somehow, thanks to Roger Ailes and other people, he told the whole story of how Nixon put together that phony baloney campaign in '68. Okay. Now, do the people talk to each other? Could you tell, when they close the door and you have your conversations with them sotto voce, do you have a sense they talk to each other the way they talk to you about the world that they share inside the West Wing?
A super good question, Chris. And I think I could tell that they were each feeling the other out on how to do this, on how do you say, oh, my God. And in many cases, they don't, because they're polarized. I mean, Steve Bannon did not speak to Jared Kushner. You know, you had these factions in the White House that were absolutely cleaved, but gradually it was actually Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon had an enormous amount of they were polarized, let's say, in the early months of the administration, and they actually came together. I think that they became quite good friends, because they understood this was an entirely anomalous situation that they had found themselves in, and it was coming apart.
I guess when you're dealing with Uday and Kusei every day, you do find common purposes. Anyway, thank you. Congratulations, Michael Wolff. Fire and Fury. I don't have to help this book, but go out and buy it, or you're missing out on the big story of this year so far.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.